in this lesson I want to talk about bebop enclosures. Now, bebop enclosures are not a new thing. They've been used in Western tonal music for hundreds of years, and traditionally we would have referred to them as upper and lower appoggiaturas to chord notes. We take a simple triad, C major triad, C, E and G, and we approach each chord note from the diatonic note above it. That means the next note up in the key that you're in. So we look at C, the next note up is D, and then go to the note one semitone below the chord note, so B, and then play the chord note. So we say that's an upper appoggiatura, that's a lower one. Now, in this case, both the upper and lower notes are diatonic. They both come from the key of C. But let's look at E. The next one up is F. That's a diatonic note. But a semitone below E is D sharp. So we say that's a chromatic approach note. Same thing with G. A is the next step up. Semitone below, though, is F sharp. So it gives you this kind of sound. Now, if you combine that with bebop rhythms and also bebop scales, remember a bebop major scale on C has that extra note in between the fifth and the sixth notes. And remember, the reason these extra notes are added to the ordinary scales is so that when we're improvising a line in eighth notes, we try to make the chord notes land on the downbeats all the time. So just using those two devices on a simple C major triad, you can get quite an authentic bebop sound. Say something like this on a C major chord. Now, I've used that kind of enclosure in several of the videos in this series already, so I want to build on that in this tutorial and add some chromatic notes. So for instance, when we're approaching the C in a C major chord, instead of going from the diatonic note D above it, we could go from the chromatic note above it, C sharp. Now, the E, if we did the same thing, it would just be the same as before because F is a semitone above E. But look at G, instead of, we could actually go for, we could also combine diatonic and chromatic notes. So staying on G for a moment, we could go from the A, that's the diatonic note a step above G, down a semitone to the chromatic note, semitone above G, down to F, diatonic note below G, up a semitone, and then finally land on the target note G. You can combine these enclosures in different ways. So for instance, we could do an enclosure round G by going diatonic note above, semitone above, diatonic note below, semitone below, then the chord note G, and then we could go, so we're aiming for E, the third of the chord, and we've done a bit of a chromatic scale there, taking us on to F, so we're just doing the basic enclosure there, or we could have ended it like this. So we're going from the G straight down the C scale to the F, and then instead of going straight to the semitone, go to the diatonic note below E, back up a semitone, so we land on E. So, or, so you can see you can combine these notes in lots of different ways. Now, so far, we've just talked really about use of these enclosures on the root, third and fifth of chords. But of course, you can also do them on other notes. You can do them on upper extensions. So for instance, if we took a D minor 7 chord Let's just try doing a basic enclosure. That's diatonic note above, semitone below, and we'll go up the Dorian mode. So that works fine, going to the root. What about this one, going to the ninth? That actually works well, doesn't it? Because the ninth is a really nice colourful sound. Going to the third obviously will work. Let's look at the G, the 11th. And again, that's a nice colourful note. Going to the fifth will work, obviously. What about this one, though? Kind of jars a bit, so that's not one I would recommend, to be honest. If you looked at, say, a G7 chord, it's going to work on the root, obviously. The ninth, yeah, nice colourful chord. Third obviously works. What about this one? Get that bad clash there. Now, if you did that and you did land on C, you'd have to then use one of the methods that I talked about in lesson 5 for when you do land on a non-chord note or a note that clashes, shall we say, on a downbeat. I talked about 5 different ways of getting out of that. And one of them, for instance, would just simply to be to put another enclosure in, taking you to the third of the chord. Let's carry on the scale. I'm going up to the 5th. That's fine. Going to the 13th is fine. Going to the 7th. So really it's just that one, the 11th, that clashes. So what you want to do is try these enclosures on different chords, just using the ordinary scales or modes, and try and work out which ones you feel work and which ones don't work. Let's look at some examples then. I like this one. So let's look what we were doing there. First of all, it was just a D minor 7 chord going to a G7 chord. And I played up an arpeggio of just a D minor triad, D, F, A, D. So I went back to the 5th, back to the root, and then I went to the major 7th, back to the 5th, then to the minor 7th, and then to the semitone below the target note, which we're aiming for, which is G7. So we're using 4 notes really to surround the note B. We're using a tone above, a tone below, semitone above, semitone below, and finally landing on the B. And the other good thing about that is it kind of incorporates that moving line, which is a common thing on a minor chord. Going down to the major 7, going to the minor 7th, and then if you were staying on the minor chord, you could make it a D minor 6 there, but we were going to G7. But it's still got that same nice chromatic feel, even though it's got other notes in between. This is another one. So let's look what happened there. Played up an arpeggio on a D minor 7 chord, but starting on the F, the 3rd. On its own, you could think of that as F major 7, but it's really the 3rd, 5th, 7th and 9th of D minor 7. And then I did an enclosure around the E, the 9th of the chord. So I went up to the 11th, back to the 3rd, semitone below the E, back to the E, down to the 5th of the chord, 7th. So, and then I changed to G7. But once again, I'm focusing on the E, which is now the 13th of G7, and I'm playing the same enclosure. And then just ending up, coming down chord notes, going to the 5th, the 3rd, passing note or the 9th, and then ending on the 5th of a C chord rather. So that's an example of how you can use these enclosures around upper extension. You've got to be careful though, check which ones work, check which ones don't work. Let's look now at what I played in the introduction. First of all, I was playing in 16th notes, not 8th notes. In other words, I was playing in double time. And when you're playing in double time, it's a good idea to use plenty of chromatic notes because you need to play an awful lot of notes. So I started on the 5th of the D minor 7 chord, A. I just did a little bit of a chromatic scale, taking me down to the 3rd, F. Now, I then did an ascending arpeggio all the way up to the 11th. And then I'm focusing on the note E as a target note on beat 4. E is the 9th of D minor 7, and I did an enclosure, so I went from the G, down a semitone, down another semitone, and then to a semitone below E, and then finally landed on the E. Now at that point, I was focusing on landing on the note D, the 5th of G7, on the first beat of the next bar. So I did another enclosure. Once again, I went from the E down a semitone. I then went down to C, which is the diatonic note just below D, but then played a chromatic note before I went to the D, so that I landed on D on beat 1. At that point, I focused on landing on the note B, the 3rd of G7 on beat 2. And so to do that, I did another enclosure. I went from the D to the C, that's the diatonic note just above B, down to A, the diatonic note below it, and then up with a chromatic note A sharp, so that I landed on B. I then played a bit of a chromatic scale, as though I was going to land on G, but instead I did a little U-turn there. I went back to A, so that I could play yet another enclosure around the note G on beat 4. So I went A, that's the diatonic note above G, down a semitone to A flat. Then I went to F, the diatonic note just below G, then F sharp, finally landed on G on beat 4. And then finally, I was focusing on landing on the note E. That's the 3rd of a C major chord on the first beat of the next bar, and I did another enclosure. I could have done this enclosure instead. Okay, hope you found that useful. If you did and you haven't done so far, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And also, I really appreciate any comments that you may have or questions that you have. I'm always happy to answer questions. Thank you. See you in the next video.